So let's talk about that big figure that we mentioned about the amount of tax that has been raked in over July alone. £100 billion in tax. I'm quite impressed by that in a weird way, because it's such a huge number. You can't quite get your head around. You can't imagine a mountain of notes piling up to form £100 billion. It's massive. However, it might be fueled by things like the national insurance hike. It doesn't really touch the sides in terms of our debt, which is 2.89 trillion. Economists, of course, are talking about this £50 billion fiscal gap. You could call it a black hole if you like. And we understand that Labour eyeing property, pensions and inheritance for October's tax hikes as U-turns and slowing productivity worsen the economic outlet. It's always a bit tricky, of course, because this is a government that have said out loud multiple times, no more tax rises for working people. Then you get into two interesting arguments. What constitutes a tax rise and what constitutes a working person? And we've already seen this with the national insurance hike. Let's get a word on this from former political editor of The Sun, now, of course, co-founder of Shillings Communications. He is George Pascoe Watson. George, always great to see you. Good afternoon to you. I mean, you've been, I say this often, you've been around the political block for many years. I was just talking about some of those old names in our mystery voice bit. I mean, you weren't quite covering the Harold Wilson elections, of course. You came after that, but you've certainly been there, seen it, done it. And you know this argument well, that governments have to wrestle with. It's constant, really. It never goes away. We're never in a surplus, are we? We're always in debt to some degree, but this is looking particularly bad at the moment.
Well, I almost feel like I should be wearing a black tie in this interview, because the state of the government's finances, and it's our finances, let's be quite clear, is as dire as it could possibly be. And I think that we should be very, very clear about that. I would say this would be true of any government which presides over the numbers right now, and it's extremely hard to see how we get out of the situation that we're in. £100 billion of tax. Why are we in this position? We're in this position because we're spending more than we earn. And everybody knows if you spend more than you earn, you get into trouble. The real problem we've got, Ian, is that the markets, the bond markets, are unlikely to allow the Chancellor to borrow more money in the future. So she's going to have to close that gap by increasing taxes further. And who pay the taxes? Our viewers and listeners today, the businesses who employ people, the businesses who invest in the country, they pay the taxes, and they don't do it for free or for love. They do it because they have to, and that means they will be restricted in their desire to invest in the United Kingdom, and that hits Rachel Reeves' growth plans. So we're in a terrible sort of negative spiral here, where there doesn't seem to be a way forward. The reason the bond markets are so important, of course, is because they set the cost of borrowing. And as you say, this country is borrowing huge sums of money, and because Keir Starmer's Labour government is not particularly strong, despite a 170-seat majority, the bond markets say there's greater risk in lending money to the UK, and therefore they put the price up, and that costs us more in servicing the debt. So it's a horrible spiral that we're in.
How do we get our credit rating back? Let's put it that way.
Well, one of the critical measurements is the strength of a government. And we've all seen in recent weeks and months that the government has been struggling to get through its main policies, despite having a 170-seat majority. So one of the first things Keir Starmer needs to do, if he can, is to show stability and authority in his own government. And if he can do that, then the bond markets will take a view that, okay, there's greater strength in the government. That means they probably can get their policies through, and that might take some of the margin off. But effectively, they need to see that the Chancellor is sticking to her big plans to rebalance the books in this country. And of course, that's really hard for her, because she's got lots of Labour MPs in the House of Commons saying, we don't want you to cut the cost of welfare. We think the welfare bill is fine. We want you to spend more on public sector salaries. And so she's caught in a political bind.
Where does that? And of course, this at a time, George, where we hear today that a quarter of Labour voters could support Jeremy Corbyn. So clearly, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, the top team on the government front bench, are trying to. I mean, it's often the worst thing you can do is try and appease everybody because you end up, pleasing nobody. But that's sort of the game they're trying to play, isn't it? We know that they had idea for welfare reforms, and that largely got ditched. Really, in reality, they claim otherwise, but it didn't really come to anything. But unless you're going to get serious, lots of our listeners and viewers say, well, things like immigration's costing £7-8 million a day when you factor everything in. These are huge numbers. Welfare, as you rightly say, and lots of other areas. But for some reason, there's a kind of almost a convention, isn't there, George, in politics, where certain areas governments don't really touch. They're either not brave enough, or they think they won't risk their political skin in order to implement it. But it's going to take some, to coin that phrase, outside the box thinking, this, isn't it?
Well, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister were right over the last year to say the only solution for Britain is greater economic growth.
Yeah.
That still remains true. That was Liz Truss's view, and it's the right solution, because only if we generate more revenue can we afford the welfare and the public sector services that we want, and the infrastructure that we need, the roads, the railways. That's what we need to do. We've got an aging population, which costs more money. Medicines are more expensive because they're more sophisticated, and so we go on. So we need to generate more revenue. That is the actually only solution. We also have to remember, Ian, and it's easily forgotten, that the cost of the epidemic of COVID was beyond anything anybody had imagined.
Yeah.
It was unpredicted, and therefore we should be honest and say it's going to take many generations to pay back the debt, and that's really the problem that we're in. But I think that if you continue to look to business to close the tax gap, then you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble, because it's the businesses that you need to invest in this country who will say, we can't invest anymore because we're being taxed to the hilt.
Well, it's going to be a grim, maybe not quite a winter of discontent in that respect, but some would say financially, this is going to get perhaps worse before it even begins to get better. George, always appreciate your wisdom and insight into these matters. Thank you, George Pascoe-Watson, former political editor at The Sun, with us on the programme. Now, of course, the founder of Shillings Communications.